Millionaire single dad sees waitress, teaching his nonverbal son to speak. What he does next changes everything. The morning rain drummed softly against the windows of Maple Street Diner as David Harrison pushed through the glass door, his 6-year-old son Tommy's small hand clutched tightly in his own. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon filled the air, mixing with the gentle murmur of conversation from the handful of early customers scattered throughout the cozy restaurant. David had discovered this place by accident 3 months ago, after yet another disappointing appointment with Tommy's speech therapist. They had been driving aimlessly, both of them emotionally drained, when David spotted the small diner tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. Something about its warm, unpretentious appearance had called to him, a refuge from the sterile medical offices and expensive specialists that had become their routine. Tommy hadn't spoken a single word since his mother's death in a car accident 2 years earlier. The trauma had locked away his voice, despite having been a chatty, laughing 4-year-old before the accident. David had spent a fortune on the best therapists, the most advanced treatments, but nothing seemed to reach his son. The boy who had once filled their house with constant chatter now communicated only through gestures, nods, and the occasional drawing. "Our usual table?" David asked softly, though he knew Tommy wouldn't respond verbally. The little boy nodded and pointed toward the corner booth by the window, the same spot they had claimed every Saturday morning for the past 3 months. As they settled into the worn vinyl seats, David watched his son's face brighten slightly. Tommy's dark hair fell across his forehead as he pressed his nose against the cool glass, watching raindrops race down the window. These small moments of contentment had become precious to David, glimpses of the happy child that still existed, somewhere inside his silent son. "Well, look who's here," came a warm voice from beside their table. Sarah Chen approached with a genuine smile, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing the diner's standard uniform of a blue dress and white apron. She had been their waitress from that very first visit, and David had come to appreciate her gentle manner with Tommy. Unlike the parade of medical professionals who spoke over Tommy as if he wasn't there, Sarah always addressed him directly. She never showed impatience when he pointed to items on the menu instead of speaking, never made him feel different or broken. "Good morning, Tommy," Sarah said, sliding into the booth across from him. "I brought you something special today." From her apron pocket, she pulled out a small notebook and a set of colored pencils. Tommy's eyes widened with interest as she opened to a blank page. "I was thinking," Sarah continued, her voice soft and encouraging, "maybe we could play a game. I'll draw something and you can tell me what it is. But here's the twist. You have to make the sound that thing makes." David watched, fascinated, as Sarah began sketching. Her drawing was simple but clear, a cat with whiskers and pointed ears. She slid the notebook toward Tommy, who studied it carefully. "What do you think?" Sarah asked. "What sound does this animal make?" Tommy looked at the drawing, then at Sarah, then back at the drawing. David held his breath, knowing his son understood but wouldn't respond. This was how it always went. The understanding was there, but the words remained locked away. But Sarah seemed unbothered by the silence. Instead, she picked up a yellow pencil and began drawing something else. A bright sun with radiating lines. Then a simple house with a triangular roof and a door. "You know what I think?" Sarah said conversationally, as if Tommy had been chatting with her all along. "I think this cat lives in this house, and every morning when the sun comes up, it sits by the window and says—" She paused dramatically, looking expectantly at Tommy. Tommy's lips parted slightly. David's heart began to race. "Meow?" Sarah suggested gently. "Do you think that's what it says?" Tommy nodded, but his mouth remained closed. Sarah drew another picture, a dog with floppy ears and a wagging tail. "And what about this friend? What does he say when he sees the cat?" This time, Tommy leaned forward, studying the drawing intently. Sarah waited patiently, not pushing, not rushing, just sitting with quiet expectation. And then, so softly David almost missed it, came a sound. Woof. It was barely a whisper, rough from disuse, but it was unmistakably Tommy's voice. David's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes filling with tears. It had been 2 years since he had heard his son speak. Sarah's face lit up with joy, but she kept her voice calm and encouraging. "That's exactly right, Tommy. The dog says woof." She began drawing again, this time sketching a bird with spread wings. "What about this one?" Tommy was sitting up straighter now, engaged in a way David hadn't seen in months. He stared at the bird drawing, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "Chirp," he whispered, and this time the word was clearer. "Beautiful," Sarah said, and she meant it. "You know so many animal sounds. Should we try some more?" For the next 20 minutes, David sat transfixed as Sarah patiently drew picture after picture, and Tommy responded with sound after sound. Each word was like a small miracle, rough and hesitant but real. His son was speaking. Other customers occasionally glanced over at their table, some smiling at the gentle interaction between the young waitress and the small boy. But David noticed that Sarah had positioned herself so that Tommy's back was to the rest of the diner, creating a private space where he could find his voice without feeling watched or pressured. When Tommy successfully made the sound for a cow, moo, and actually smiled while doing it, David had to excuse himself and step outside for a moment to compose himself. Through the window, he watched Sarah continue the game, her patience and kindness evident in every gesture. When he returned, Sarah was teaching Tommy simple sign language along with the sounds. "This is the sign for please," she demonstrated, and Tommy carefully copied her movements. "How do you know sign language?" David asked quietly. Sarah glanced up. "My younger brother was born deaf. I learned when I was about Tommy's age." She looked back at Tommy with understanding. "Sometimes we need different ways to communicate until we find our voice." The breakfast crowd began to pick up, and Sarah reluctantly had to return to work. But she left the notebook and pencils with Tommy, who clutched them like treasure. "Same time next week?" she asked Tommy directly. He nodded enthusiastically, and then, looking directly at her, whispered, "Thank you." Sarah's eyes glistened. "You're so very welcome, Tommy." As they prepared to leave, David stood uncertainly by the table. "How do you thank someone for giving your child back his voice? How do you repay a kindness that no amount of money could buy?" "Sarah," he called softly as she passed with a coffee pot. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped aside near the coat rack by the door. David pulled out his business card, his hands shaking slightly. "I need you to know what you just did for my son. I've spent 2 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get him to speak again. The best specialists in the country couldn't reach him. But you, in 20 minutes, Sarah looked at the business card. Harrison Technologies, David Harrison, CEO, and her eyes widened slightly. But when she looked back at David, her expression remained the same, kind, genuine, unimpressed by titles or wealth. "Mr. Harrison," she said gently, "I didn't do anything special. I just sat with him where he was and waited for him to be ready." "That's exactly what makes it special," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Listen, I know this might sound presumptuous, but would you consider, that is, I'd like to offer you a position. As Tommy's companion, teacher, whatever title you'd prefer. I can pay you far more than you make here. Provide benefits, education assistance if you want to pursue child development or speech therapy training." Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking across the diner at Tommy, who was carefully drawing in his new notebook. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrison, I really do, but I have a job here, and these people depend on me. This place has been like family to me." David felt his heart sink, but Sarah held up a gentle hand. "However," she continued with a small smile, I work here Tuesday through Friday. My weekends are free. If Tommy would like a friend to practice his animal sounds with on Saturdays and Sundays, I'd be honored to spend time with him. No payment necessary. Just let me be his friend." David stared at her, overwhelmed by her selflessness. "Sarah, I can't ask you to do that for free. Please, let me—" "Mr. Harrison," Sarah interrupted softly. "Some things can't be bought. They can only be given freely. Tommy needs someone who wants to be with him because she cares about him, not because she's being paid to care. Trust me on this." As they drove home, Tommy sat in the back seat quietly practicing his animal sounds, occasionally holding up his drawings for David to see in the rearview mirror. Each small meow and woof was like music to David's ears. That evening, as David tucked Tommy into bed, his son looked up at him with bright eyes and whispered, "Daddy, I like Sarah." "I like her too, buddy," David said, his voice catching. "She's pretty special, isn't she?" Tommy nodded and then, in the clearest voice David had heard in 2 years, said, "She helped me find my words." David kissed his son's forehead, his heart full to bursting. "Yes, she did. And tomorrow we'll practice finding even more words, okay?" "Okay."